Russia will be holding talks there over the situation in Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky, though, not invited to the negotiations and insisting a peace deal to end the conflict can't be made unless he is involved. Well, he's currently in the UAE and will be heading to Saudi in the next 2 days for a pre-planned visit. But he won't be sitting at the table with the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, who will be among the Russian team heading to Riyadh for talks with Donald Trump's team. Meanwhile, European leaders preparing to hold an emergency summit in Paris later today to discuss the situation. And ahead of that meeting, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, said he's willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a peace deal if one is reached. Well, our international correspondent, Diana Magnay, joins us now. Diana, President Zelensky heading to Saudi Arabia but won't be meeting delegates. The optics here, certainly from a Ukrainian perspective, are pretty dire.
Well, he won't be meeting Russian delegates, but that would be a very big deal. And I think the way that Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is pitching this series of talks that he's going to be having in Saudi Arabia, and that is presumably today with the Crown Prince, and tomorrow we know now with the Foreign Minister of Russia and a presidential aide, Yuri Ushakov, as well, is that these are really just very preliminary talks that you can't get to even a process for peace unless you start talking to the Russians. And he also said in an interview last night to the American network CBS, which is really all we've got to go on how America sees these talks, that of course once you get to actual negotiations, peace negotiations, then the Ukrainians will be at the table and the Europeans will also be at the table because they have interests in the whole situation also. But that this is very preliminary. Now, the optics of him actually meeting at a very, very high level with his Russian counterpart don't really align so much with this idea that these are just sort of talks to get to kick the ball rolling. But you know, that's as much as we understand the American thinking on this. I think Donald Trump believes that to end war in Ukraine, you've got to start talking to the Russians, and that's why he has called Vladimir Putin, and that's why Marco Rubio is now meeting with Sergei Lavrov. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in the region. He's held talks today in the United Arab Emirates to try and secure further prisoner releases from Russian custody. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been quite instrumental in that role already in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And now he's going to go to Saudi Arabia. I think it will be very instructive to see whether the US delegation remains in place to have talks with him when they're there. That will be the real crux of the matter, to see how seriously they are taking Volodymyr Zelensky in all of this. But clearly, I think what's quite apparent is that Donald Trump likes talking to people he considers to be the big guys. And that for him is Saudi Arabia, that for him is Russia, that for him is the United States sitting there at the table. You know, he thinks that the EU looks weak and vacillating on Ukraine. He thinks that Volodymyr Zelensky is sort of the loser in all of this. He doesn't want to be dealing with them. He wants to be dealing with Russia in a forum hosted by Saudi Arabia, who he also thinks of as a key player. And that the optics of that are very stark.
How does Europe and Ukraine respond to that then? Because, you know, we're seeing the European leaders hosting this fairly hastily arranged meeting in Paris today, kind of almost on the sidelines politically and physically in many respects. What will the response be from European leaders to that position that you've just made with regards to Donald Trump and the White House?
Well, I think they've recognised that from all the language that they heard at the Munich Security Conference, and they know that that's the sort of shape of Donald Trump. This was what they were worried about. There's long been talk that people were scared that, you know, he would go over the heads of the Ukrainians and try and negotiate a deal about Ukraine without Ukraine. And this certainly looks as though it's heading that way. But I think it is a wake-up call to Europe to spend more on defence, to get their heads around how they are going to provide better security guarantees for Ukraine. And that is exactly what Donald Trump wants too. So I think in that capacity, you know, we are going to have to see more concerted action. It is almost as though Donald Trump comes along and he throws a sort of grenade into the Middle East peace process by putting in this position of this proposal for clearing out all the Palestinians from Gaza and making a Mideast Riviera. He throws this bombshell into European sort of ideas about Ukraine by saying, I'm going to negotiate with Russia. And it does focus minds to then come up with an alternative solution. You know, that's what we're seeing in Cairo at the moment around Gaza, an attempt to come up with an Arab proposal to counter Donald Trump's. And I think that's what's put the cat amongst the pigeons for Europe too, to see how they can best manoeuvre given the way things are going. But I think just to come back to what the US Secretary of State said, peace does not happen with one meeting. It happens with a series of meetings. You know, Donald Trump is the best negotiator in American politics, was how Marco Rubio put it. And he will be able to tell pretty quickly with Vladimir Putin how serious he is about peace and whether we aren't in a situation where in 3 or 4 years' time Russia will just push into Ukraine again. So there is merit to changing the strategy and deciding, you know, as Donald Trump clearly has, to see whether any weight can be placed in what Russia says. I think this is the beginning of a sort of long game, but we shall have to see. You know, Donald Trump does actually move quite fast. This is a high-level meeting that we're going to be having in Riyadh tomorrow. Trump has said he wants to meet Vladimir Putin in person in the next couple of weeks. So, you know, it's difficult to judge. We'll have to see what comes out of Tuesday's meetings, how Saudi Arabia, Ukraine and the Americans interact. There's still a lot of progress to be made. But I guess also what's interesting is that Donald Trump has made it clear with the Ukrainian president that he sees this as transactional. You know, he's made this pitch to Ukraine, which he wanted Zelensky to sign a few days ago when he sent the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, to the Ukrainian capital. He wants a deal on Ukraine's minerals. And Volodymyr Zelensky has said, I will sign that if you are prepared to give concrete US security guarantees going forward, because apparently the deal on the table was simply that Ukraine should sign away its minerals in the east, currently in an area under Russian control, in exchange as a sort of reparation for the amount of money that the US has invested so far. Now, that's not a good deal as far as Zelensky is concerned, but he's saying, if you promise to give us security guarantees going forward, I'll think about it. So there are a lot of moving parts to these negotiations. But I think we all knew that Donald Trump was, A, deeply transactional, B, interested in talking with big powers. He believes in big power politics, and that is the shape of things to come.
Diana Magnay, thank you so much.